Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you're watching this. I'm Sam, and I'm going to be teaching a Sunday school class for the next few weeks. And the title of the Sunday school class is It True? And that is, this is the most important question in the world. The most important question in the world is not, how did God create the earth? The most important question in the world is not, how old was Moses? The most important question in the world is, can we trust the Gospels? Can we trust what they really have to say? And so I want us to look at this what we're dealing with. We will deal with the truthfulness of the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, you remember, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call them that because syn in Greek means the same, S-Y-N, like symphony. And optic, of course, means see, so to see things. So the Synoptic Gospels, they all look at the same sort of stories in the life of Jesus. And so the question that we will ask is, do these Gospels tell us the truthfulness about Jesus? Do they tell us the truth about what was really going on? And if they tell us the truth about what was going on, that leads us to the truthfulness of the Gospels. And if the Gospels are true, and Jesus really was God, and Jesus really did come to earth, and he really was crucified and rose again, then that is the most important question in the world. That leads us to the truthfulness of the resurrection. That's the centrality of Christianity. If you choose to believe that God created the world in a different way than I do, it doesn't destroy Christianity. If you choose to believe that the pastoral epistles were not really written by Paul, that doesn't destroy Christianity. But if you choose to believe that Jesus was not God, didn't die for our sins, or wasn't resurrected, that is the core of Christianity. And so in this class, we'll be looking at the core of Christianity. And we want to think about the fact that this doctrine of the resurrection is the most important doctrine in the Bible. That is, there's no way for us to get to anything else outside of this doctrine. And you see the passage here in 1 Corinthians. This is Paul. The earliest book of the Bible, of the New Testament, is Paul writing to the Corinthian people. So in 1 Corinthians, probably around 50 to 53 AD, he says this: if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is futile and your faith is empty. That's as clearly stated as it can be. If there's no resurrection, then let's close the church down and do whatever we want because it doesn't make any difference at all. So this will be an outline of the entire class. Not what we're doing today, but an outline of the entire class. We'll be asking three basic questions. The first question is what we have what they wrote? Sometimes you hear people say about the New Testament that it's like a game of telephone that people used to play back in the day. And you would have a line of 10 people, and one person on the end would get a message, and they would give it to the next person. And by the time it got to the 10th person, it was nothing like what had originally started out. And so they will say, that's what the New Testament is. What started out is nothing like what we have today. And so I want us to ask the question, is what we have today what they actually wrote? Then I want us to ask a second question. And the second question is, did they believe what they wrote? That is, were Matthew and Mark and Luke writing down things that they knew were just stories, or did they really believe what they wrote? And the third question is what they wrote true? That is, if we have what they wrote, and if they believe what they wrote, then it ought to affect the way that we live and act today. And that truth ought to change our lives. So today I want to begin by talking about it's a warning story. And it's a warning story about being careful about things that we hold to be true. And it's the importance of truth in defending the gospel, a modern story. And so this happened just within the last year. And so I want to pay some special attention to it because it had made its way sort of as an urban legend all around Christianity. So the importance of defending the gospel is a modern story, and there are a variety of people that are involved in it. Let's first of all look at the players who were involved in it. There was Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a very famous, I guess he's an agnostic now. At one point he was a Christian. He went to Moody and to Wheaton. Then he became an agnostic and divorced his wife. Then he became an atheist, and he said he's a happy atheist. Now he's married to, what I understand, is a very kind and gracious Christian woman, and he has changed from being an atheist back to an agnostic. It's what I hear, and I hope and pray that you'll make the move back to Christianity. Bart Ehrman is a very, very famous person in Christianity because he does all that he can to tear down the truthfulness of the Scriptures. Dan Wallace, on the other hand, is a great evangelical and a man who loves the Scripture, loves the Lord, and does all he can to make sure that the Scriptures are survive so that everyone can read them. There's the Museum of the Bible. You remember this museum from Washington, D.C., and the problem with the Museum of the Bible is that it has been convicted is too strong a word, but it has been guilty of buying both fraudulent manuscripts and manuscripts that didn't really belong to the person who was selling them. Then there's Elijah Hickson, who is a friend of Josh's, whom you know from the church, and a friend of mine. And Elijah Hickson is a young textual critic who has spent a lot of time working on this. EES is the Egyptian Exploration Society, who owns a huge cache of manuscripts found in a place in Egypt called the Oxyrhynchus. It was a sort of a garbage dump. And they found all this papyri there 100 years ago, and it's still being put out today. And then there's Dirk Obink, who was in control of much of the Egyptian Exploration Society manuscripts. And there's one whom I will not name, and that will become clear why in a minute. He will be the one whom we should not name. The problem is, and you can copy this YouTube down if you want, is that Dan Wallace and Bart Ehrman were in a debate in Dallas, Texas, and there were a big crowd. And the night before the debate, someone had come to Dan Wallace and said, "Listen, I want you to know this. The Museum of the Bible, owned by the Greens, has bought a piece of papyri that comes from the 1st century, and it's from the Gospel of Mark. That would be not only the earliest piece of the Bible that we have, it would be the earliest, by far, piece of the Gospel of Mark that we had." And so this one who shall not be named, he told Wallace that, Dr. Wallace, and Dr. Wallace took him at his word. In the debate with Ehrman, Wallace said, "I have breaking news. There has been a 1st century copy of the Gospel of Mark found." And Ehrman said, "Well, where is it?" And Wallace said, "I'm bound by secrecy. I can't tell you where it is or who has it." And it created, this was several years ago, it created this gigantic controversy with Ehrman saying, "If you can't tell me who owns it or where it is or who has identified it, then it's of no value. And so it became this sort of war between those who are critical of the text, saying the first century mark doesn't exist, and those who depended upon the nameless one, saying, yes, it does exist, and it will come out sooner than later. And the problem is that this led to other people making this claim. It wasn't just Wallace who made the claim. Robert Hutchinson makes the claim in print, of all things. Craig Evans made the claim. And so the problem with this sort of thing is that it spreads, and people make the claim thinking that it's true when it's really not. And the problem gets worse, unfortunately. It gets much worse. In May of 2018, Elijah Hickson, who is obsessive about textual criticism, he does it all the time, and he found a forthcoming publication. The Oxyrhynchus papyri is still being published, even though it was found 100 years ago. He found a forthcoming publication of the Oxyrhynchus papyri that contains an early section of Mark. Not first century section of Mark, but third century, still the earliest piece of Mark that we have. And it turns out that this first century Mark that we had been waiting for 8 years was not now dated in the first century, unfortunately. The person who told Wallace about these things says that he never said any such thing to Wallace. Now, I'm a friend of Dr. Wallace. I really think the world of him, and there's no doubt in my mind that Wallace is the one who's telling the truth here. The problem is that now Wallace and evangelicalism are left with a black eye. And Ehrman comes out looking like he's telling the truth. So you have Wallace for 8 years saying, there's a first century mark, there's a first century mark, there's a first century mark. And you have Ehrman on the other side saying, show it to me, show it to me, show it to me, and tell me who dated it. And it finally comes out, and it's not from the first century. And Wallace is left looking really badly. As you'll see on the next slide, Wallace just denies that any of these things ever happened. I mean, the person who told Wallace this in his room denies that anything ever happened. Wallace has, in print, made a public apology for doing those things. He has made a public apology to Dan Wallace, and it was just a bad situation. There was a special session last year in San Diego at the Society of Biblical Literature, and the special session was, let's put an ending to the first century mark. And Wallace was not one of the speakers, although Elijah Hickson was and Bart Ehrman was. Wallace usually wears a Hawaiian shirt almost everywhere. If you ever see him on a video or anything, he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt. That day he wore a black shirt, saying, well, since it's my funeral, I suppose it was good that I went ahead and wore a black shirt. He knows that he made a mistake there. He knows that he shouldn't have done this, but he came out looking badly, and Ehrman came out looking good. On the next slide, you'll see that even after this, the problem gets even worse. Even if you can imagine this, it gets even worse. Dirk Obink, who is he's a world-renowned dater of manuscript. He's the one who dated the first century mark at first. And he showed this little, it's not the whole Gospel of Mark. It's a little tiny piece, about a little bit bigger than a credit card. He showed this to a variety of people, including Wallace, and they were laid out on his pool table as he showed them to people. And many of the documents that the Museum of the Bible purchased came in one way or another through Dr. Obink. The problem is that these documents belong to the Egyptian Exploration Society rather than to Obink. And Obink has since been arrested. Just in the last month, Dr. Obink has been arrested for selling documents that didn't belong to him. And these documents don't sell for, $1.99. These are world-class, one-of-a-kind documents. They belong to the Egyptian Exploration Society, a representative of whom was at the SBL meeting, along with someone from the Museum of the Bible. And the Museum of the Bible, to their credit, immediately said, anything that we have of yours that was stolen, we will immediately give it back without question. Now, Obink claims that this is just a misunderstanding, and he'll be completely cleared, and same sort of thing that people say. Maybe it is really just a misunderstanding. But selling, and it's not just this first century Mark that he sold. He sold a variety of manuscripts that didn't belong to him to the Museum of the Bible and to other people. Allegedly, I should say, sold those things. And so, what lesson do we learn from this? If we're going to ask the question, is this true? What kind of lesson do we learn? First of all, we learn that those who are defending the God of truth must be sure of their own truth. We can't defend the God of truth with things that aren't true. And that's the reason that we ought to be very, very careful about speaking to things that are outside our area of expertise. I'm not a scientist, so therefore I don't make scientific claims. I'm a historian that has studied the first century. And so I'm fairly confident when I say something about textual criticism or the historical Jesus. But when we get out of that realm, I'm not an expert. And so I don't make crazy claims about that truth. And all of us ought to be sure that we look carefully and make sure that things are the truth. And so next week, we'll look at some urban legends about the Gospels and about Jesus. There are stories of Jesus as a little boy. You may not know that, but there are other stories about that. There are stories about the apostles and how they died, which are probably not true. And they have somehow gained the credence of this sort of idea that it must be true because I've read it in a book. And if it wasn't true, who would have taken the time to write it down in a book? But you can't trust everything. We are a people who love God, and God is a God of truth. Therefore, we must make sure that what we say is the truth. In the next slide, you'll see more information, and essentially, there's a long read article about in The Guardian a few weeks ago about Dirk Obink and the first century Mark and Dan Wallace. If you Google those names, you should be able to find them. And if you Google Oxford scholar arrested, you'll find more about the arrest of Obink. One last thing in the last slide. If you would like to have these slides, please send me your name and email me so that I can make an email list and send these out to you. I don't mind sending them out once a week, but if you come in on the 5th week and say, hey, can you send me all the slides, I'm not going to be able to do that because I can't keep up and mailing individual things. I'm going to mail these out once a week. If you send me your email, I will be more than happy to send these out to you. Make sure that you mention you saw this at the cross so I don't send you out the wrong PDF. And I hope that by the time we are finished, you will be able to say that the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ is the most verifiable event in ancient history. And that if it were not a miracle, everyone would believe in it. If it were not for the fact that believing in the resurrection forces us to Christianity, everyone would believe in it. The evidence is that strong. So we will see you next week, and I hope that this has been a blessing to you.